Okay, so welcome to the second webinar of our series for the Jitterbit Harmony 9.0 preview program. Today, what we're going to do is review some of the progress that we have made in the last couple of weeks. We're going to talk about any logistics issues that people are having about the preview program. And then we'll review the new use cases that you can now do in the next couple of weeks so that you can really explore the system. All right, so let me switch over to my PowerPoint. And I'll take questions along the way. There's no need to hold off on questions this time. We'll keep it more informal. So Harmony 9 preview, it's been a couple of weeks since our original webinar, and I believe that signups are still happening. So I wanted to sort of throw it out there right now just to make sure everyone is clear on what the next steps are, which I'll review at the end as well. But specifically for signups, I want to start talking about that before we move on to the actual product. Then we'll talk about the new use cases that we're introducing today. We'll talk about, we'll do a demo just to show you, again, some of the functionality, and I'll try to focus on more of the new functionality over the last 2 weeks that we've introduced. And then we'll wrap up with next steps. So as far as signups go, does everybody have the terms of agreement? I think you received a DocuSign, and I'm trying to confirm who you would have received that from. It wasn't me. Stephanie Anderson possibly is our admin who set that up. And so you might find an email from her or from DocuSign in your inbox. But I'm going to have Stephanie actually resend the DocuSign to everybody. So if you don't find it in your inbox, just hold on tight. We'll get her to resend it, hopefully today. Okay. So that's for the terms of agreement. And once you're done with that, you can create a trial account on the system. We'll get you hooked up with all the links that you need for that system. All right. Any questions on signups? Any concerns, issues that you want to tackle right now? No? Okay. Great. All right. So this is the original set of use cases that we presented to you 2 weeks ago. Sorry, my dog is a little restless. This is the original set of use cases. As I said, a couple of weeks now have gone by, and we've added a few more functions, features to the preview system. So originally, we only had, so for example, the Salesforce query, and you write a JSON file to a target. We had 2 FTP servers where you could move files between 2 FTP servers. So we've expanded now to moving files between HTTP and FTP. Query, for Salesforce, we are not quite done with upsert and update, but for databases, we do have that now. So let me this is just background. Let me go to the new use cases for the preview program. And these are all based on Design Studio. The API manager, it has not really changed in the last couple of weeks. Functionality on that is pretty complete already. So what we have introduced is bidirectional integration with a database. So you should be able to do an update, an insert. I believe upsert is also working. So you can now do bidirectional between a database and an FTP server, or a database and a REST API, for example. The second one is what we call in Desktop Studio is called the archive operation, where you're moving files, but you're not really transforming them. And that's between HTTP and FTP source target connections. So that's working now. Writing a script, we've enhanced that to include the referencing of operations, referencing of functions, and variables. We don't quite have referencing of all project items, such as connections, sources, targets, things of that sort yet, and plugins. But that's something we're working to complete. So scripts, as you can imagine, is quite a big area of the product to fulfill. So we wanted to provide you the functionality as we developed it. And then finally, we are able to chain multiple operations in the workflow. And we also introduced global variables in your workflow. I know that global variables are very commonly used, so you can now use those to write to them, then read in the next operation, etc. So these are the 4 areas that we feel that would be fruitful for you to explore. Our Slack team, I do have a pinned spreadsheet that shows you exactly what features work. Also shows you known issues that we have. For example, we had an issue with connecting to Oracle databases in some instances, and also Postgres database drivers. But we will keep those updated, and we'll try to get that fixed as soon as possible. Okay. Any questions on these, or even on the previous set of use cases? Has anybody from on this webinar logged into the system actually and used it? Possibly not, because I know the startup, you had the terms of agreement and all that to go through. So if not, that's fine. You can certainly go back to the previous weeks, the previous sessions use cases as well. They're similar. You just have a little more functionality now with the new set. So do try any of these use cases and give us feedback. We'll send out probably a survey but toward the end of this 2-week period before the next webinar, so that we get a little more structured feedback. But we're looking for feedback in all kinds of ways. And we might reach out to you as well with one-on-one sessions so that we can get your specific feedback. Okay, so if there's no more questions on this, let's do this. Let's move on to, so the upcoming webinar, just to wrap up the slide set. We'll have another one November 30th, but actually we might change that because we're pretty close to November 30th now. So I think we'll shift these out by a week. I just forgot to update the dates, so we'll shift them out 1 week. Next steps, just to recap, the preview agreement, that's really important to get done. Once you get that done, everything else sort of follows from there. The Slack team, documentation, you'll get access to a whole lot of information. And feel free to give us feedback through email if you need it, or the Slack channel. So let me jump over now to the demo system. So I'll jump back. I'm going to actually show you the demo on our QA system. And that's because later today, so by end of day, we should have a new build in the previous system that has some of the new function, and it has all the new functionality that you need for the new use cases. So it's not there on the preview system yet. So that's why I wanted to use this system instead. So let's see, we have this project here, database to API response. I just built out this project. You'll see a couple of changes here. So I'm going to walk you through this use case, but let me just note a couple of changes to the user interface. We've collapsed the palette. This is the endpoints that you're going to use. They're down to 1 tab now. Notice that you can filter these endpoints to see all the available endpoints or the ones that you've actually configured. So these are your endpoints that, for example, I've configured these 5. I have an API, request and response. I have a database. And now, as I said, you can do an insert, upsert, update. FTP, you can read and write to your FTP servers. You can use global variables. So you have now a read and a write to your global variable. You could think of this as sort of your source and your target global variable. But instead of having 2 completely separate components, which is what Desktop Studio does, this is just one configured endpoint. And if I edit it, you'll see there's a global variable name, and that same name will be used when you use this read and write activity in your operation, like here. Okay, and then finally I have a Salesforce endpoint here. Not all these are working. Delete, upsert, and is not working, but Salesforce query is working. Okay, so having said that, we've also introduced scrolling, a little better scrolling now, so that if you have a long workflow, you can scroll. We've reworked this project pane to organize it a little better, so you can see your project-related environment here, and then you're dealing with your workflows here. You can search for components and just X out of that to return. You're seeing your dynamic workflows here. This one is I forget what this one is for. I think it's upcoming functionality. So let me just walk through this use case. So what did I do here? I basically dragged over an FTP read operation, right? Not an operation, an activity, I guess. I'm going to read from this FTP server, transform the data to a database insert. In the next operation, I'm going to query the database, again, do a transformation and write to a global variable, right? And then finally, I'm going to take the same global variable. I'm actually going to run an operation from the script, which is here. I'm going to run this operation and return an API response. Or I'm going to write to an FTP server. So there's some things going on in the script, right? So that's basically the use case. Not that it necessarily, it's not a real life use case. I wanted to demonstrate that there are different types of operations you can have, and you can use these different types of activities. So I'll just create a new one here. And the way, again, to create these operations now, to show you how that's done. So let's see, I'm going to start with my FTP endpoint, and all I really do is find my endpoint, which I've configured. I drag over an FTP read operation, right? And then I drag over my database insert, right? So I select my endpoint, I drag over my insert, and then I can add a transformation in between. So again, in between, you might find it a little tricky, but if you hover in between, that's where you get the option to add a new transformation. So you see that the transformation is not configured. That's because we really need to configure the activity itself. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. So I'll take the FTP read, and you see there's a menu that pops up when you click on it, and I'm going to edit that activity. So I'm just going to say, well, I'm going to read a file name, right? So I'm going to just read this file from there. I'm not going to give it any fancy filter, but it's actually also my schema file. So now I just populate the schema in here. So this is my sample schema file. Notice I'm doing that in the activity as opposed to the transformation. So now I have my activity with the schema and the file name that I'm going to read. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side, where I'm going to have a database insert. Again, this is new. So I'm going to select my table to insert into This step is really mostly to get the columns of the database table. So you can skip it. There's really no configuration to do. That's your table that you're inserting into, and you're finished. So fairly simple. And really the only thing that's different from Desktop Studio here, it should be a very familiar experience. The only thing that's different is that rather than define your source and target schemas inside the transformation and activities. And so now I can go ahead and do my mapping. You know, this is just for illustration, so I'll just do a couple of these. Okay, and it's auto-saved, and I can be done. So now I can do an I want to create a second operation, right? So I'm going to do a database query in that case. So I won't go through building the entire use case that I showed you before, but here's the database query, and I think I'm going to write it to a global variable, which I've configured here. So I'm going to do a write operation on that, a write activity. I need a transformation, so I add it in there. Again, I won't configure the whole thing right now, but let me just say, okay, so let me call this operation db query to gv1, right? So now what I want to do is just to link these together, you just click here. I called it this. I do have operations in other workflows, as you can see, but this is the one that I just created in this particular workflow. So I add this to my outcomes. So now it's listed in here. I could add a failure operation as well if I wanted to. So let's say I run a different one, right? I'll just pick one for now to illustrate. Okay, so that's my current state of the workflow. You can see that I've now gotten a success outcome here. Success outcomes come from the left, failure outcomes come from the right. And the reason this thing's sort of ending up in this stub here is because we're building out the functionality to show that it's going to a different workflow. And you'll be able to click on this and go to the actual operation in the other workflow. We haven't quite built that out yet, so we're just indicating that this is now connected to an operation in a different workflow. So that's pretty much the demo for this time. You could, of course, do the same thing with the Salesforce and other endpoints. I didn't use the Salesforce or the API today, but feel free to do that as per the use cases. So at this time, let me open it up to some questions. Anybody get confused by this or have any clarifications they would like to ask? Well, as you can see, let me make one point. We also added this idea of something that you haven't configured is in orange background. And this one, these two are not orange anymore because I've actually configured a schema in them. This one is, these two are orange because I haven't configured the schema yet. Okay, does somebody have a question?
Okay, Rajesh, this is Scott. I'll throw one out. Suppose I wanted to add a pipeline transformation, so maybe on what came in on the FTP read. Could you give us a preview of where that would be declared? I mean a plugin. I'm sorry, a pipeline plugin.
Oh, plugin. Okay, okay. Yes,
sorry.
that's what I figured you meant. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that is actually not built out yet. So
Okay.
we're going to add that plugin. Yeah, I think it'll be probably not the next webinar, but the one after that should have plugins.
Okay, and so I'm picturing that there'd be some, you'd click on something around the FTP read and the transformation, and it would open up and give you an option to declare that that a pipeline plugin transformation happens in here. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the pipeline plugin, and I believe you add those in your during your transformation configuration
I
in
think they're
desktop
typically declared on the source
on the source. Okay,
or on a target. You know.
exactly. So you would do that here. You would
Yep.
just edit that, and then you would have this extra option of not just the schema, but these plugins. You
Sure.
can define that. Yeah, and we'll work with you to define that user interface too, because we want to make it easier and intuitive. So yeah, so I'll be
Okay,
reaching out
that's
to you
good.
to do that.
Hey, and this all looks very nice, by the way. I'm impressed.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, we've gone through a few iterations now. I think a few weeks ago, if you had seen it, it would have been a little raw, but we made some changes such as collapsing all the endpoints into one. And I think this helps a lot, being able to say, well, just show me my configured endpoints, as opposed to cluttering it up with all the possible adapters that you might have available to you. So yeah, good. Thanks for that feedback. And certainly you'll have more when you actually use the system. So
Yep.
look forward to that. The workflows are an interesting area. Then I would love to have your feedback. As you use the system, a couple of areas that we think need to be a little more defined is the idea of workflows. So today they sort of work like folders, operation folders, if you will, from desktop. But the difference being that as you build out an operation chain, that folder, this workflow gets automatically filled out. So you see the structure there. So then the question becomes, well, what if you have an operation that's not really chained to something in this workflow, but it's in this workflow, the operation's there. So you can imagine a folder with just a collection of single operations that you might have. You could build that here. But the intention of the workflows here is really to show you the structured way of listing the operation. So I'm kind of interested in your feedback on how that works for you all. We're also working on other areas such as the reuse of components, and we'll be able to drag a component from this search or filter view into a new operation, right? We can do that with some things, not with scripts. I think we can do it with connections. But it's a little tricky today. So I would say we're still working on that. It should really be a reference and not a copy. But it gets confusing between referencing and copying and deep copying. So we're working through that user experience. Today, it's always a copy, by the way. What's implemented right now, it's always a copy. But I think we need to make it more of a reference to the same endpoint as opposed to a copy of it. But that's it for today for the demo. Again, let me just flip back to next steps. If you don't have the preview agreement, you should be getting the email again in the next day or so. Or you can find it in your inbox, I think, somewhere from Stephanie Anderson or DocuSign. All right, anything else? Anybody else? If I left out anything, bring it up now. Okay. Well, thank you very much again for taking time to participate in this program. And I really look forward to engaging more with you, of course, after Thanksgiving. So you all have a great Thanksgiving weekend, and we'll be talking next week or two.
Thanks, Raj.
Thanks,
All right.
Roger.